Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June member education session. My name is Destiny Carrington, and I am joining you all from Dale City, Oklahoma. Here at NAP, I am the Indigenous Leadership and Education Programs Office Administrator. It is my joy today to welcome you all on behalf of Native Americans in Philanthropy. I have been with NAP for 3 months now, and it has been a whirlwind. I have learned so much about Indigenous communities and approaches to leadership from my friends and coworkers here. I have also had a front row seat to the attacks on Native nations, governments, and the unique relationship that Indigenous people maintain as distinct legal entities as sovereign nations. Today, though, we have a special program. Here at NAP, we're focused on ensuring our MES remains helpful and relevant to this point in time. Tomorrow is Juneteenth, a celebration of liberation. Today's topic in our partnership with APFI that even makes this possible highlights the importance of inclusion and the power of collaboration, building philanthropy rooted in Native traditions and values while we explore the advocacy for responsive and transformative investment in Black and Indigenous communities. A priority for us in approaching this work includes ensuring our conversations encompass an intergenerational approach. Aside from encouraging you and your organization to adopt this practice as it fits, we've done this each month this year and are excited to continue the practice by extending a very special welcome to one of our Native Youth Grant makers, Gianni Lacey Howard, as today's junior moderator. Welcome, Gianni. I cannot wait for you all to meet them later. Now on to the show. Communities of color understand the enduring impact of colonization, which continues to present itself to this day. There's a growing call for solidarity between Black and Indigenous peoples, rooted in the shared historical injustices inflicted upon each of our ancestors. Today's social justice movements require collaboration and a space to stand together in demanding acknowledgement and redress. Reparations are one key solution. Today, we'll be exploring that solution. I'd like to welcome to the stage Bobby Trae Trousdale. Bobby Trae is NAP's Education Resource Facilitator and will be moderating today's panel. Bobby Trae has been an active behind-the-scenes participant and coordinator of our MES program since last fall and will be making a transition to the front of the camera for the next little bit. Welcome, Bobby Trae.
Thank you so much, Destiny. I greatly appreciate the warm welcome and am absolutely ecstatic to begin joining these conversations on this side of the production as well. I felt bad for our behind-the-scenes crew as they've had to witness my thinking face and endless head nods when our previous panelists have been dropping absolute fire. So I'm glad this is a burden that everyone now has to share moving forward. Let me start off by saying Bojoni Khan, Bobby Trae Trousdale, Nadeshnakas, Tecumseh, Oklahoma, Nadochbia. Hello, friends. My name is Bobby Trae Trousdale, and I am from Tecumseh, Oklahoma. As Destiny mentioned, I have the honor of working as the Education Resource Facilitator here at NAP, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our June MES Regarding Reparations. I'd also like to kick off our time together with a resounding Happy Pride. However you find yourself observing this month, we hope your June has been filled with warmth, celebration, and community. NAP is proud to affirm that all identities are not only accepted, but that they are needed, valued, that they are sacred, and that they always have been. To my fellow queer or 2S LGBTQ relatives, happy Pride, y'all. And yes, my y'all means all. I'm also very honored to acknowledge that today's program is made possible by a partnership with APFI. APFI is one of the leading philanthropy-serving organizations focused on racial equity in the U.S. For more than half a century, APFI has prioritized Black communities in their work, and NAP is excited to welcome them and their viewers into our space today as renewed and strengthened partners together in this work. Today's program is filled to the brim with brilliance and excellence, so let's get started. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that today's topic of reparations means different things for our communities based on the context of what our relatives have endured. The many policies of the federal government have attempted to eradicate tribes and their sovereign status as nations, and the policies of structural racism must be addressed. The nuances of this conversation must be acknowledged, and balancing the weight and heft of each perspective represented on our panel should not be positioned to detract from the other. Rather, racial inequalities are pervasive and oppressive harms that have been inflicted upon all people of color. We stand in solidarity in bringing awareness as we all prepare to celebrate Juneteenth. We approach this conversation with an abundance mindset, not one rooted in scarcity, and a shared belief that philanthropy has the potential to make systemic and impactful change. Now, let's get started. Panelists, as you are called, please introduce yourself, your affiliations to our audience, however you'd like and feel comfortable, and we'll dive right in. So as part of your introduction, if you could also outline how you personally define reparations and or briefly summarize their importance. Let's do it. I'd like to bring first to the stage Gianni, our junior moderator for today. Gianni, hey, and welcome.
Thank you. Miku, Gianni Lacey Howard, Miklaka Nela, Wagliwa Mnyante Biwa. So greetings, I am Gianni Lacey Howard. I am Afro-Indigenous and an enrolled citizen of the Occaneechi Band of the Potawatomi Nation of North Carolina. And I have served as a Native Youth Grantmaker with Native Americans in Philanthropy in last year. And I'm just so happy to be here with everyone as a junior moderator. And to start off the discussion, reparations to me is the process of rectifying wrongdoings by reestablishing the state conditions before the wrongdoing was committed. So it's really just the action of repairing communities that have been disenfranchised in society. And it's really important because it goes beyond redistributing wealth, but it's an ethical practice of really taking accountability for how we care for each other in our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gianni. Next up, I'm going to bring out the one, the only, the Esquire, Temi Bennett. Oh, Temi, I think there may be some technical difficulties on the back end. Oh,
wait, am I here?
You're here.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Thank you, Trae. Hey, Gianni. Super happy to be here. I am in Washington, D.C., so I do want to acknowledge the original stewards of this land, which were the Anacostians, but also known as the Susquehannocks and the Piscataways, the Pamunkeys, and we say Anacostia, but just not Anacostians. They were originally, I'm blanking, y'all, sorry. But I want to acknowledge that the original stewards of this land who are no longer here and have been subject to attempted genocide. A little bit about me. I'm an attorney by trade, living in Washington, D.C. I live in the beautiful neighborhood of Bloomingdale in Ward 5 in Northwest D.C. I was raised in a Black nationalist Pan-African community on the south side of Chicago. I identify as a cisgender woman using she, her pronouns, and a Black feminist. I am also a descendant of American enslavement. My folks were enslaved in North Carolina, Arkansas, and Virginia. My people are Black people in America, Black people in the diaspora, and people of the global majority. If you haven't caught on, I have a deep love and reverence for Black people. I do this work in honor of my ancestors. I do it in the interest of my current family and friends and future descendants. About if we are a private regional racial justice foundation based in DC. We fund in Southern Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia. Our vision is that Black people and people of the global majority live powerfully, abundantly, and beautifully in healthy, self-determined communities free of social, economic, and ideological violence. Our mission is that we will achieve our vision by centering the leadership and expertise of Black people and people of the global majority living at the sharpest intersections of oppression, namely in particular race, class, and gender identity. So that's me in the organization. And then Reparations, and what does it mean for me and my people? I want to acknowledge that Black people have been fighting for reparations since the abolishment of chattel slavery. I also want to acknowledge some of that history of harm, beginning with 246 years of chattel slavery, followed by the congressional mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, talking about violent government-backed massacres like the decimation of Tulsa, Greenwood, Rosewood, discriminatory policies in the 20th century, including Jim Crow era Black codes, strictly limiting opportunity in many Southern states, the GI Bill, the New Deal, Fair Labor Standards Act, exemption of domestic and agricultural service occupations, and redlining related to contract buying. The American government extracted, prevented the accumulation of wealth, of healthy, thriving communities, of investment in these communities, of choice, of economic mobility, that, all these things enable a capitalist system to thrive. And we know capitalism is based off the extraction of labor and genius from other races to promote white advantage. Two of the biggest wealth extractions in this country took place during the stripping of Black farmers' land and then the 2008 housing crisis for Black people. So all that to say, it is the 405 years of collective harm by federal, state, local government, private industry, and individuals that have created the inequities that we see among the Black community today. So for me, reparations requires a few elements. One is resources. By resources, we mean land and money. Two is policies and programs in the areas of wealth building, education, housing, environment, health, employment, and the criminal legal system and democracy. And three, which is the most dubious of them all because it's rooted in the very fabric of American imperialism, is the end to anti-Blackness. And so that is an end to anti-Blackness and future government policies and practices. Once these reparations have been made, then we can start getting to a place of repair. And for me, repair is not getting what white people have, right? Repair is about self-determination, and self-determination rooted in principles that is indigenous to African culture, particularly Ujima and Ujamaa, and Ujima and Ujamaa respectively is collective work and responsibility and cooperative economics, right? So not this individual self, it's about community and collective upward movement. And it's about dreaming and imagining a world that we do not see today, right? And so that's going to be really rooted in Afrofuturism. It's going to be rooted in destruction of white supremacist systems, white supremacist ideology, but also in the construction of our identity and rebuilding a world where everybody thrives and there is a collective responsibility for everybody thriving. That was a lot. I can pause, Trae.
Okay, I was going to say, I feel like I already need to start taking notes. So I am so glad this is being recorded because that is a lot to go back and learn. But we are so excited to have you joining us. I just want to say our partners at AbbVie, I think when we mentioned that we would be doing this session, you were the first name to come to mind from multiple different sources. So you have some major fans over at AbbVie and here at NAB. So welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Of course. Next up, I'm going to be bringing up Dr. Dana Arviso. Dana, are you ready for this?
I am, and I'm really excited based on what Temi just said in her opening remarks to have this conversation. I think it's so important that we're having this conversation across like Native and Black panelists because we have so much to bring to this conversation. So I'm Dana Arviso. I serve as a senior program strategist for Native Voices Rising. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation who grew up mostly in California, and I live and work on the lands and waters of the Chocheno Band of Ohlone people in Oakland, California. I define reparations as a moral and ethical opportunity for repair for the historical harms that the United States has caused to Native American and African American communities. This includes both a formal apology and measures to restore wealth that was generated from stolen land and natural resources and forced labor through slavery, and restoring that wealth back to these communities through different forms of economic justice. I have a lot more to say, but I'll let us get through kind of these introductions first.
Sounds awesome. Sounds awesome. Well, last but certainly not least, we'll be having Dr. Amber Banks as part of our conversation today. So Dr. Banks.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here today for this conversation, and just honored to be on a panel with Dana and Temi. My name is Amber Banks, and I'm the Vice President of Programs at Decolonizing Wealth Project. I'm calling in today from the lands of the Shawnee, Yuchi, Cherokee, and Chickasaw people. These lands were unceded and continue to, honor the history there. I grew up in Southern California as a Black biracial woman. And from the very beginning, I have been a bridge builder, and that continues today. In terms of reparations, there's no repair in this country without reparations. Reparations is the making visible of the truths and harms that our ancestors have had to endure, and righting those harms of the past so that we can move forward into a liberated and thriving future. It's acknowledgement, it's apology, it's healing, and it's repair. And in order to do this, we need the radical redistribution of wealth and the passing of reparative policies that allow Black and Indigenous communities to engage in self-determination and exist in systems or outside of systems that do not cause any further harm. In terms of Decolonizing Wealth Project, the organization was founded by Edgar Villanueva, a Native man from the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina in 2018, after his book, Decolonizing Wealth. And I oversee our liberated capital funds that seek the redistribution of untethered resources to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color-led movements for racial healing and liberation. So I know we'll get more into it, but we've redistributed about $15 million to movements for healing and repair across reparations, land back, truth and reconciliation for Black and Indigenous communities over the last 5 years.
Wow. Well, as you can tell, we have, I think, just an amazing panel today. So thank you all for your time and for joining us. And thank you to our audience. So if you are viewing today, we are seeing a few of those like welcome and introductions come on out. So please do sound off. Let us know where you're joining from, and we can really make this mosaic of, I think, representativeness across Turtle Island visible in those comments. So please continue to do that. But to get us started, we're going to go ahead and pass it to Temi, if that's okay. So we'll go ahead and get started there. But likewise, audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do feel free to throw those in your comments wherever you're joining us from as well. And we will make sure that those are integrated into our program or set aside at the end, time permitting. So Temi, we'll go ahead and get started with you. And my first question is, can you please attempt to conceptualize reparations work and calls for reparations in Black communities?
Yes, and thank you for that question. And actually, let me acknowledge, because I was like sitting here, how I'm gonna be with Native Americans and Philanthropy and be messing up names. And so the original, the Anacostions here were erroneously named Anacostions, and the actual name of the indigenous tribe that was originally here in DC was the Nacotchonks. So sorry about that, y'all. Okay, let me get me together. Now, Black folks in the reparations movement right now, contemporarily, like, so again, going back to Black people have been fighting for reparations since the end of enslavement. And then we've had moments of popularity and movement and action, and then it dies down, because that's what happens whenever there is a backlash to any Black liberation movements in this country. And prior to the movement we're in, the moment we're in today, the last time reparations was really in the forefront of folks' mind was in the 1990s. Despite the stagnation of federal legislation, what we're seeing now is unique in that there are local jurisdictions, right, standing up task force, conducting studies all across the country. And so you have Evanston, you have New Jersey, you have New York, you have Chicago, you have California, you have San Francisco, like, so not only states, but locally around here in DC, we have the DC Reparations Task Force. We also have PG County has a task force. And so what we're seeing is local action in a way that we've never seen historically, with passages and actually standing up task forces. Some of these task forces have resources in ways that they've never had before. Particularly when I think about resources, I'm thinking about California's task force. What's unique about California's task force is that it was in partnership with the DOJ. What that meant was that they had resources in the way that most task forces don't. They also had subpoena power. So even when task forces are stood up, they're often under-resourced and underfunded and understaffed. And so with partnership with the DOJ came that subpoena power, that they were able to demand records in a comprehensive way that we have not seen before. And what that history in those records, we had the interim report that came out last year, and then the end of well, 2 summers ago, and then the end of last year, the full report and the recommendations, hundreds of policies coming out of the study that California has done with their reparations task force. So one, what's unique about this time in the movement is the local agency that's happening, and the local movements, and they're all learning from each other. You have the national movement, and then you have the local movement, and you have like the national conference. Decolonizing Wealth did a conference last year, November, in Atlanta that I was at. But then also First Repair I think First Repair is all about local reparations and like really trying to bring jurisdictions together so that when local task force are being stood up, they can learn from each other. They can write the best and most comprehensive bill that's happening. And that all happened under Robin and the work that she's done in Evanston. And so that's an annual conference that happens in Evanston every November as well. Was that helpful for did I answer everything in your question?
I think you did. It's just, if you think that is, I think, like a good way to conceptualize it, we're just trying, I think, get everybody on the same page and in the.
Yeah. The other thing I will say is like the biggest debates around, and that's happening right now around reparations and Black reparations in America and in the American context, right? Because there's the movement that's at the UN, there's a global movement there, but in the American context, the debate is always about the what and the who, right? So who gets it? And is it descendants? Is it lineage? Is it descendants of American enslavement? Or does African immigrants fit into that definition as well? And then it's the what. Is it money? Is it land? Is it policies? Is it practices, etc.? And so that's the biggest debate beyond like the fact that a debt is owed, is the who is the debt owed to, and what is the debt exactly. I can pause here.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. So next I'll be talking to Dr. Dana Arviso. Dr. Arviso, we previously mentioned in a kind of that intro that the nuances in the reparations conversation exist. And I think especially when approaching that topic from an Indigenous perspective, because we know like the taking of land and resources, that government to government relationship as sovereign nations, and the status of that sovereignty, the trust and treaty obligations owed to tribes exist wholly outside of the concept of reparations. So we want to leave space for that. But can you please attempt to contextualize reparations work and calls for reparations within Indigenous communities?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that I wrote an entire dissertation on this topic, so I could talk at length about this, but I want to situate my response in just like a little bit of framing about loss of land and how that relates to some of the issues that we're facing in our Native communities now. So I'll just start by acknowledging that I often struggle to reconcile working in a sector that upholds income inequality through capitalism and settler colonialism. But I have been reminded by Native leaders that we can resist and redefine these structures by recentering ourselves in our own traditions and lived realities. I want to share a couple of stories that relate to the origin of poverty for Native people, because that is an outcome of racial capitalism and the land and resource extraction. When I was a new executive director for Potlatch Fund back in 2011, I was building a relationship with a regional foundation, Northwest Area Foundation. Their program officer invited me to a local convening at the Lummi Nation with 3 of their tribal grantees. And when I arrived, the group was sharing their collective learnings kind of at the halfway point of a 10-year poverty reduction initiative. that was called the Tribal Ventures Project. During this panel, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribal Chairman Harold Frazier spoke about their experiences in the first few years of the project, when they were trying to ground their strategy within their tribal community. He told the story of how he went to a group of tribal elders to get their blessing to carry out the work, and he asked them to translate the word poverty from English into their language. Much to his surprise, they told him that there is no word for poverty in their Lakota dialect. The best translation that they could provide for poverty was to be without relations, which they explained would be a rare occurrence, usually only reserved for someone who had been banished from their community. In every other instance, you would be taken care of and provided by your relatives and the community in any times of need, just as you would do for others in times of abundance. That's just the way that Native people are. This story really resonated with me, and I've retold it many times over the years as a way of explaining just how deeply rooted our Native values of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationships are within our Indigenous concepts of philanthropy and community care. 5 years later, I was also struck by another example that revealed how our traditions of giving were disrupted by colonialism. This time I was part of a planning committee for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's grantee convening at its Seattle headquarters. Along with Potlatch Fund, Suquamish Foundation was also in attendance to highlight their partnership with the Kitsap Community Fund. Along with the director of the Suquamish Foundation, we realized that this gathering provided a unique opportunity for an audience of regional grantmakers to hear from Suquamish Tribal Chairman Leonard Forsman. He reminded us that historically, Native people were once considered rich, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where people lived with an abundance of natural resources. Instead of thinking of poverty as being synonymous with Native people and their identity, we really need to understand that as a modern problem for tribes that directly resulted from being colonized and stripped of their land and resources. Afterwards, some of the questions and comments from the audience really demonstrated that they were unsettled by this historical truth. In both of these stories, it's clear to me that there's a dire need to help the philanthropy sector understand that the connections between where the wealth of where the United States came from, including philanthropy, and what it means for the responsibility towards addressing kind of this myriad of devastating impacts that have happened to Indigenous people because of colonization. I just want to be clear that tribes should not be experiencing economic poverty when much of philanthropy's wealth has resulted from profiting from resources that were ceded by tribes or taken by force by colonizers moving on to Indigenous lands. And I believe that this is alone like a justification for really dramatically increasing the amount of funding that is going towards supporting Native communities. There's no reason it should be half of 1%. It should a proportional amount to our surviving percentage of the population should make that at least 2 to 3%, and a just amount would be more like 10%. But I just want to share that these stories can help us understand the responsibility that philanthropy and our government should in feeling accountable to justifying and restoring that wealth back to Native Americans. So I'll start there, but I definitely want to talk, more about how we restore wealth. But that is an opportunity I see, and then the other part of what I was really passionate about in my dissertation are what are these opportunities for solidarity between Native communities and Black communities.
Absolutely. I think that we will absolutely be getting to that, because that's the point of our time together today, is to really, I think, get in that overlap. And I would be lying in saying if that wasn't partially inspired by your work and your dissertation. So you've done amazing work in leading that for Indian country, and so very excited to do that. All right, Amber, Dr. Banks, if you're ready, I think we just need a bow on this. Can you please illuminate the overlap in these communities and why their respective efforts must be inclusive of one another regarding reparations?
Thank you, Trae. Well, I can't promise a bow, but I can promise some perspective. So a lot of my work over the last 15 years has centered on the ways in which our relationships and our repair efforts are rooted in our context, in our identities, in our histories, and the varying ways that we each arrive to this work. So before I say anything, rebuilding trust and the work of repair requires that we truly see each other's truths. What has happened to Black and Indigenous communities, there have been unspeakable atrocities for centuries as a result of colonization and racism. The horrific violence, erasure of our histories, and the trauma experienced over generations means that we carry the memories of both pain and triumph. And in the work at Decolonizing Wealth that I lead, I've had the great honor to walk alongside both Indigenous efforts for truth and healing and Black efforts for reparations as well. And so, you know, as a result of all of this, what I see is that we are still here, y'all. We're still fighting. We are remembering our cultures, our ancestors, and our truths. And through it all, white supremacy has sought to diminish us, but we refuse. Our histories are distinct, but we know in our bones what it feels like to come from peoples who have endured so much and who carry so much brilliance, resilience, and joy. We come from kings and queens and carry their legacy in this work every single day. And nonetheless, the forces of capitalism and colonization seek to separate us at every turn. They separate us from the land, from each other, from our power. This is how systems of oppressions have thrived, when we are disconnected from who we are. But the efforts that we're talking about here for reparations and repair do not allow us to be pit against each other and be trapped in scarcity mindsets that lead us to forget the abundance that is all of our birthright. So the Black and Indigenous movements for reparations and repair are a force for reconnection, reconnecting us to our histories and our power and creating space for healing for all of us. I think it's critical to remember as we have this conversation that healing does not happen overnight. There is dialogue, learning, and connection that can and is happening across Black and Native communities. And this learning can form the foundation of an alliance that can bring together the best of who we are for repairing the worst of what this country has been.
Perfect. Are you kidding me? So absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. All right. The next question that we'll move on to is what are the various forms that reparations can take? And do they have to be monetary to be valuable? So I'll kick that to Dr. Arviso first.
That is a good question. I think that part of what I've argued in my dissertation and even earlier in my comments is that, you know, I do think that this is a form of economic justice. So I do think that that needs to be centered in this, along with formal apologies. I'm thinking a lot about what's happening with the land back movement in Native communities. And often, though, tribes are buying back their land. So they may not be getting funding from the federal government to do that. I've seen some examples of where tribes are pooling foundation funding, their own money that they have within their tribe, and also private donations in order to make that happen. But, you know, I think Native people are in the process of acquiring even more land through the land back movement. And, you know, I do think that there is, it's a very viable solution for Native people being able to restore their relationship back to land and all that that brings with it. And a lot of that becomes like cultural teachings and practices and access to traditional foods. But I feel like there's still people who are kind of confused about how that works. And I would say that some of the confusion about what the goals of the land back movement are could be attributed to a lack of historical knowledge, some willful ignorance, some of which we've seen in the backlash to critical race theory in public schools. but also kind of these internalized settler capitalist notions of property ownership. It's very problematic to think of land as only private property that one can own across generations, or to develop, exploit, or sell for profit, instead of kind of this indigenous notion of treating land as our relative. But, I think there have been kind of a lack of concrete examples for white settler descendants in terms of imagining what giving land back to its original native inhabitants and caretakers could actually look like. But we have seen, quite a few examples, I think, beginning in 2020 and 2021. I'm aware of a few examples in the Pacific Northwest where, for example, in December 2021, 2 miles of waterfront and 125 acres of tidelands were rematriated back to the Squaxin Island tribe in Washington. This was a land gift, which was significant because it was part of the Squaxin Island tribe's ancestral lands and waters. And it was actually given back from a timber company, the Port Blakely Companies, who had acquired it after the tribe ceded land with the signing of the 1854 Medicine Creek Treaty. The tribe was actually able to also separately buy back an additional 875 acres of forest lands that had been part of their traditional territories too. Their tribal chairman, really said that it serves as concrete action that goes beyond what mere acknowledgement usually doesn't commit to. So really fascinating examples that are out there. And I think that was part of my goal in my dissertation, was to try to document examples of where land back is happening. And it's not always happening in the same way. I think there's different examples of when land is given back, when land is put up for sale and tribes are given an opportunity to bid on it first, when federal government allows for more co-management practices between tribes. So there's sort of a continuum of practices that I think about. But I think at the root of that is money helps. I don't want to make it sound like just giving land back is the only opportunity. I really think that resources help tribes to be able to make decisions about which lands they want to repatriate and what they'd like to do with that land after they've reacquired it.
Absolutely. Dr. Banks, same question to you. What are the various forms that reparations can take, and do they have to be monetary to be valuable?
Yeah, I would agree with Dana that economic justice has to be the foundation of reparations, but it doesn't stop there. I think one of the most important things is that, the communities and tribes who have endured this harm, we must listen to them about what form reparations can take. And we've seen across the country home ownership, land, educational access, that there's a variety of different forms of reparations that are rooted in the history and also meaningful to the current context. So I think it's important to think expansively about what form reparations take and not make any assumptions about what healing may look like for a particular community. I think at the federal level, however, there are some some acknowledgement and apology for the history of boarding schools and, the horrific theft of Native children, and, the Federal Reparations Commission, establishing that at the federal level. There's a HR 40 is a bill that was introduced decades ago that, there's no reason for that not to move forward. So I think it starts with the inquiry and lifting up the truths, and there's no shortage of reparative policies and approaches to addressing that repair. And the one thing a couple things I will name. So Prentice Hemphill, who is a Black leader and healer, shout out for their new book that's out, also talks about the body as a site of healing. And I would just advocate that, reparations must include sabbaticals and rest and much needed self-care for Black and Indigenous leaders who have fought tirelessly for decades for the movements for repair. So I think it's important that you know, there's an owning of the history and apology for the harm, and then dialogue about the forms of reparations that are needed in the most expansive form.
Tim, go ahead and also pass that one to you. Is what are the various forms that reparations can take, and do they have to be monetary to be valuable?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I said originally, like, which is resources. One, resources, land and money. Two, policies and programs. And three, the end to the anti-Blackness. So we're talking about changing the material condition of a community, and that's not going to happen without material, right? And I think there are some schools of thought, though, that of Black academics and Black activists that believe that it's just monetary, right? And one of them is Sandy Darity and his wife, Kristen Mullen, who wrote From Here to Equality. And they believe that only the federal government can pay reparations, and it's at the tune of $14.3 trillion. And then really going back to focusing on, their focus is on economics and how Black people are 12% of the population, but hold only 2% of the wealth. And they believe that reparations is just a check from government for $350,000 per person. And then when advocates say, well, what about, disparity and like the discrimination and anti-Blackness and all these other systems, example, healthcare, right? And Dr. Darity would say, and this is what he testified at DC, because he did come, when we did the DC reparations hearing, we brought in schools of thought from everybody. We flew in everybody. We gave a grant to DC Justice Lab to bring in, we wanted a diversity of thought, because there is a diversity of thought out there. We wanted everybody on the record. And Dr. Darity talked about how, well, if you have more money, then you have better access, right? And so if Black people have more money, then they can get better doctors. But we know that that's not how these systems operate. And we know that, like, even when there have been moments of Black prosperity and Black wealth in this country, white supremacy in the system like adapts to strip us of those economics and that economic freedom. And so that's why I think it's imperative that these other elements be a part of any reparations program. I do want to talk about also like Dr. Arviso's comment around the debt philanthropy owes, because I absolutely agree. And so it goes beyond, like, it's not just government that owes a debt. There are private actors, there are private institutions that owe debts as well. And we believe that everybody should be held to account and should reckon and pay those debts back. And if we also, as an organization, in 2020, when we came out as an organization for the first time in support for reparations for Black people, we also felt that we should be held to account as well. The sector should be held to account. And so we believe in systems change at the government level and at the sector level in philanthropy. And we felt that anybody could say, well, yeah, you're pushing and you're advocating for reparations from government, but you too owe a debt. And so we wanted to acknowledge the glass house that philanthropy lives in. We came up with this idea of studying our wealth origin to see how much of that wealth was extracted from Black labor and Black genius. And with this hope that organizations will begin to engage in acknowledgement, redress, and repair. And so we went to NCRP and commissioned Cracks in the Foundation, which is the report on philanthropy's road to reparations for Black people in the DMV. NCRP studied our endowment and the endowments of 7 other foundations in the region to illustrate the ways that our wealth origin and our wealth had started from extraction and is built and compounded from the extraction of Black labor and Black genius. And we are starting our repair process, but we're hoping that this is a pilot. The methodology can be repeated, right? And we're hoping that this is a pilot for all of philanthropy to begin to engage with the debts that we owe and to call those debts into account. I do want to put the link, if you guys want to share it, to how folks can download this report, check it out. This is only the beginning. We believe that it's not just wealth origin, it's where the wealth has been held, it's who holds the wealth today, who's managing the wealth. The representation is just as important. And also, like, it doesn't matter if we do 5% and we give away 5% to Black folks and Indigenous folks, if the vast majority of our endowments are still causing harm as they're making these wealths, right, in these extractive markets that we know continue to happen. So we believe there should be an iterative circle of repair and reparation and calling into account past harms, not just from the government, but from the sector, from private actors, from private institutions as well.
Absolutely. I'd actually like to stay in that vein. I can think of no better, I think, transition to our next question, but I'll open it up for the entire panel. Can you speak to the role of the government, nonprofits, and the private sector in that pursuit of reparations? And in particular, I'd like to leave space here as well to potentially provide commentary on the taking of land and resources and the responsibility and promises made via treaties and the trust relationship between as a government status for tribes in particular. So I would throw that to you, the panel, and Dr. Banks, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so so you want me to speak to the land theft? Is that the question? Can you
if that's something you feel comfortable with, or just speaking to that role of government and nonprofits? It's kind of a two-parter.
Thanks. I would just underscore what Temi said, that, we have to look at the origins of wealth and really examine the ways in which that wealth has been built on the backs of Black and Indigenous folks, and how that wealth needs to be redistributed through endowments, through grants, through the multiple mechanisms, through investments in Black and Indigenous communities. And so, the government in particular, one of the taglines that Edgar often shares is money is medicine. If money has been used to cause harm, then it must be used it can be used as medicine for repair as well. And the same is true for policy. Government has been used to pass harmful policies, and there is a paramount responsibility to to take accountability and shift resources through repair, through financial redress, through policies that restore Black and Indigenous communities from the economic theft through land and resources. And so government in particular requires that there's the commissions and the truth telling that's happening across this country in many, many states and local areas, that those commissions are allowed to go forward, that those, in California, there's the Truth and Healing Council that's been established. And, that report needs to reflect the truths of the Native California people who have so bravely come forward to share their stories. I think the example of the Reparations Task Force in California as well, that report is phenomenal, and, really does lift up the stories of, what Black folks have had to endure in California. And now comes the time for legislation. It's time to put those recommendations, to take them off the paper and put them into action. And it is the responsibility of those who are in government to advocate for those policies, to be vocal about the recommendations that are coming forward in those reports, because what's the content of those reports is people's truth. And, we don't get to repair until we see it all the way through. It can't just live in a report. It has to be felt in real life through tangible investments, like in Evanston, like through some of the land back efforts that have been successful throughout the country. So I think we're at a point right now where there is momentum, there is power that has been built, and where governments need to move past a space of fear of the truth and actually recognize the gift that is contained in the reports, contained in the truths. I was just in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court has dismiss the case on the Tulsa Race Massacre, allowing that case to go forward to discovery. And, the oldest living survivors are 109 and 110 years old. And there are receipts, there are indisputable facts that the atrocities of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, there's a responsibility of those in government to allow cases like the case that's being fought by Justice for Greenwood to move forward so that we can move towards repair.
Wonderful. Yes. Temi, I will throw it to you for this question of the different roles for the different sectors.
Yeah, I believe that everybody has a role to play, right? And it's not just like the self-interested people, right? It's not just Indigenous peoples. It's not just Black folks that we have to fight for our own liberation. We do, right? And we will. But I do think that there's a place for co-conspirators and accomplices in this movement. And it doesn't matter your sector. So even from individuals who are maybe in philanthropy in an institution that is not supportive, right? There are still roles for those individuals to play. I think our fight is getting the persuadables, right? And so I think that when you look at history, when you look at reparations in Germany, right? Originally, the majority of the populace was not supportive, and then once they started, when the government started paying reparations to the Jewish community, then they started getting on board. So I do think that sometimes, even in the midst of the lack of popular support, it is still the right thing to do, and there can still be catalyst movement in action. And then I think that when it comes to the sector, yes, we have a role for philanthropy. We have a role to advocate for reparations for our people, but then also we have to hold into account the debts that we owe ourselves. When it comes to the nonprofits have come to us and said, well, what are they supposed to do with this report, right? For the Cracks in the Foundation report that we did, how can they hold their funders account? And I do think we have to be realistic about power and dynamics. And so for us, it's don't stop getting funding, right? I think it's on the sector to galvanize the sector. We're not telling any nonprofit to risk their grant dollars and grant making dollars to try to carrot stick their funder. And so I do think we have to be conscientious of power and how power operates. I do also think we have to be conscientious of harm that happens even in the midst of the movement, right? And I say that to say, even in our work, we consider ourselves disruptors. And when you are a disruptor, disruption happens and there is fallout. And so even with the Cracks in the Foundation report that we did, this is 3 years in the making, right? It took us 3 years to get this report out that was published in January. And this report is to acknowledge and to reckon with past Black harm. And in the midst of doing this work, Black people were harmed. And so I have two Black colleagues that are no longer in their roles because of this work. They're one of the foundations imploded and is no longer in operation right now, right? One of my colleagues quit, the other one was let go when the foundation severed them because they were shutting down their doors just because of a report. And this is all publicly available information, right? And so the data that NCRP did. And so I think the other thing, and what I want to acknowledge, is the truth telling and the storytelling that has to take place. I think that we don't want to hurt people's feelings. I think it is unique when it's family, right? For example, some of the and I keep referring to the report because this work was so fresh. Some of this harm is so fresh, and when it comes to calling people into account, people are like, my daddy was a good guy, my grandfather was a great man, right? But his actions say otherwise, and we're not just, and both truths can be both of these truths can be true. He could have been great to you, right? That does not mean he did not cause harm. And naming that harm does not disparage him so much as we're talking about history and calling history and talking about facts, right? And there needs to be some accounting and some reckoning with these actions of your grandfather or your father. I think for us, even like we're not a family foundation, we are an HMO conversion. We used to be Consumer Health Foundation. And prior to shifting to racial justice, we were a health equity, racial equity foundation. And our wealth origin was completely different. The story of our origin as an institution is completely counter to what we ended up finding was the truth, right? And so the story that I had been told when I came into the foundation 6 years ago and had been told since the creation of the foundations in the 1990s was that Black people and Jewish federal government workers came together in the 1930s and created Group Health Association. And in the South, Association to Humana, that cell became our endowment, right? And we became Consumer Health Foundation. But it's like when NCRP like gave us our report and our timeline, some of this is like actually it's like duh, like what is happening in the 1930s? Healthcare is segregated, okay? Even if Black people and Black people for Group Health Association were de facto let in to the HMO after they were financially struggling when they were only dealing with white folks, when they only allowed white folks. And then when Black people were allowed to be in, it was segregated systems of healthcare, right? Like they could only go to Freedman's Hospital in DC at Howard University versus all the other hospitals in this city. And so there is something, and there is a power in naming history. There is power in storytelling. And regardless of your feelings, we have to say the names. Because when we don't say the names, it's very easy to shift accountability, shift responsibility. Oh, we had nothing to do with that. Oh, no, you do. Right. The record says it right here. Your name is here. Then there is a different ownership. There is a different feeling about what's owed and the debt that we owe. And so I think there is power in the name. I think whenever we can, we should always name it. And I think we should be recognizing power, right? So even if you can't name it, talk to the folks that can, right? We can be in communal. I can't say it over here. We can leverage each other's relationships and do what you can. I say that to say, don't harm yourself. Right? Be protective, protect yourself, right? But also be subversive. Like this work also takes subversion. And so like let's be as subversive as we can, and let's be community as much as we can, right? Despite the fact that we won't always agree. If the goal is liberation, that means we can still be in community. We might have different strategies, we might have different pathways to get there, we might have different opinions on the best ways, right? But I think what should happen is that always open communication, always be in community, always rooted in love, right? That is what philanthropy is love of humanity. And a lot of us have forgotten that in the interest of scarcity mindsets, power, hoarding, gatekeeping. And so I feel like I went off on a tangent, but I just want to say, I think we can't cancel each other. I think we have to say the names. There's power in naming the things. There's power in naming the harm that has been done. Everybody can get in this space. Everybody should be in this space. And we should be persuading the persuadables to get into this space with us.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Not a tangent. And even if it was a powerful one that needed, I think, to be said here. So thank you. Dr. Arviso, I'll throw it to you now for that question of what are the roles of government, nonprofits, and private sector in the pursuit of reparations?
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to read the report that Temi has referenced because I'll just say that I did not come to, well, I don't even know if I consider myself an expert on this, but I didn't come into this space knowing quite enough. I knew more about the land back movement than I knew about reparations. And I've spent the last few years really reading as much as I could, learning as much as I could, sitting in on different webinars and really building up my own knowledge so that I could understand, like, how are these two liberatory projects that are parallel but have opportunities for interconnection, like how does this all work? One of the webinars I just want to acknowledge that was really helpful for me in understanding this question was Indian Collective hosted a couple of webinars in the spring of 2021 and 2022. And they were really trying to kind of educate their network about the case for reparations and explain how it is connected to the land back movement. And I think one of the things that I just want to lift up that Crystal Two Bowls had said in that webinar was that she really wanted us to understand that from a Native perspective, when we talk about repairing the harm of loss of land, it not just means returning the land, but it also means making amends and taking responsibility for the harms that have been caused by policies and practices that cause Native people to lose their languages, cultures, ceremonies, and spiritual connection to the land. And in that webinar, a lot of the panelists did kind of put that moral and financial responsibility for reparations back on the federal government. I think philanthropy does have a role to play by funding advocacy and amplifying the call for reparations. But really, it's ultimately our government that crafted and deployed the most harmful policies. I also want to just say that this is consistent with like historical arguments that have been made by Darity Jr. and Mullen that reminded us that reparations programs have been used strategically in the United States and throughout the world to provide this redress for these grievous injustices. So we think about the US government's provision of reparations for Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. The German government's provision for reparations for the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, the Canadian government's provision for compensation to Indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from their families and confined to Christian church-run Indian residential schools. So we do have examples where this has happened in history, and it really isn't far-fetched that we can make that happen here in the United States and have it be used not just for reparations to Black communities for slavery, but also thinking about the stolen land and how do we rectify that. I will say more about the role that I think philanthropy can play, but I think that is actually the next question.
I was going to say, I don't want to step on Gianni's toes, but I think you've kind of queued it up perfectly for me to welcome Gianni Lacey Howard as our junior moderator today. Gianni is a Native Youth Grant Maker here at NAP, so we are very excited to have this perspective and this kind of next generation of leader included in these conversations. And so I will just cede our time and our floor to Gianni. So Gianni, welcome.
Yes, thank you. And that is a perfect segue into the question. So I guess if you'd like to start, Dr. Arviso, what is or what could be the role philanthropy plays in reparations?
Absolutely. So, the United States government should pay reparations for these injustices. But I think it's also critical that philanthropy do this kind of self-reflection and research about their origin stories of wealth and whether that was built or connected to stolen land, stolen labor, or extractive resource industries. I'll give one example of where I think this has been modeled well. So Northwest Area Foundation's CEO, Kevin Walker, is often very explicit about Northwest Area Foundation's commitment to investing 40% of grant dollars into Native and tribal communities over the past decade. In the case of their wealth, it comes directly from Lewis W. Hill, who's a part of the Hill family that built the Great Northern Railway from the Midwest out to the Pacific Northwest. So they acknowledged that railroad ran through Blackfeet country and played a crucial role in opening up the Northwest to settlement and economic development, but that the railroad's progress was not of or by or for the Native peoples whose lands it crossed. So their foundation funds Indian country as a matter of justice and common sense in acknowledging the ways in which the railroad really opened up westward expansion. So, I think that as we, try to imagine this decolonized future where Native people are able to regain control of their lands and African Americans are able to gain reparations for their stolen labor and work towards Black liberation, We really need to have the courage to deconstruct these systems that have perpetuated harm and ensure that we have the adequate resources to heal and rebuild our communities. And I just think about, this current moment that we've been in the last couple of years where the racial justice movement has really exploded. And, I just think that there's so many intersections between the various movements for Native land and water rights, cultural survival, sovereignty, and the movement for Black lives. I understand that our struggles for liberation are not the same, but we are bound in our shared history of having our land and labor stolen in order for white settlers to generate vast amounts of wealth.
That's a really great point. And I will pass it to Dr. Bell if you'd like to add any comment to that as well. So what is or what could be the role philanthropy plays in reparations?
Thanks for the question. So before I go there, I just want to go back real quick because we did not mention the private sector. And I just want to name that the private sector has a huge role to play as sort of the engine of extractive capitalism in this country. And so back in 2020, many corporations pledged up to $340 billion in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd towards racial healing and repair. And only a small fraction of that funding has been deployed 4 years later. So they become essentially emotional pledges or, PR stunts, and not real accountability for the role that the private sector has played in perpetuating these harms and how much these many companies have benefited from Black and Indigenous labor. And so I just wanted to lift up one example of a company that Decolonizing Wealth Project has partnered with, which is Lush Cosmetics. And Lush Cosmetics has been on a journey around learning about reparations and understanding the history, and has recently launched a campaign around reparations that includes providing information. And there's, educational opportunities in over 200 of their stores nationally. But I just want to lift them up as an example of where the private sector can really lean into these conversations, educate employees, and direct resources. They have product donations, they have grant programs, and they currently have a campaign that is focused on I mentioned Tulsa earlier, but the efforts around justice for Greenwood. And there's a soap that they're selling, and the proceeds go to racial healing and repair organizations. So just want to lift up that the private sector plays a critical role in all of this as well. In terms of the philanthropic sector, Decolonizing Wealth was really founded on transforming the philanthropic sector towards reparative philanthropy. And so, since 2018, DWP has been advancing this model of reparative philanthropy and has influenced over $600 million of philanthropic capital that has been redistributed to Black and Indigenous movements. So the way we define reparative philanthropy is the redistribution of resources in a manner that acknowledges the extractive origins of philanthropic wealth and how colonization, slavery, and the forms of oppression of the accumulation of that wealth that philanthropy protects and grows can be redistributed. So there's a huge opportunity, and I would just lift up the Bush Foundation, for example, in Minnesota, which has taken $100 million from its endowment and redistribute $50 million to Indigenous communities. It's held in a trust, and the Indigenous communities there in Minnesota are, exercising self-determination around where those resources go, and $50 million to the Black community, moving the money in a similar way. And so it's not, the barriers are the will to do it. There are plenty of examples where wealth has been redistributed. The Kate B. Reynolds Foundation in North Carolina is another organization that was founded on tobacco money and has redistributed that wealth towards supporting the Black community in the area in which they serve. And so philanthropy, can't take accountability for the harms that the government has endured, but philanthropy also has benefited from the accumulation of the wealth from those policies that government has passed over many, many years to drive the creation of that wealth. And so I completely agree that everyone has a role to play in this. The last thing I'll say is the role of individual philanthropy. So we have a group of folks in our liberated capital community who give untethered resources that we redistribute to the organizations, Black and Indigenous organizations that we serve. And so, you know, just to say that if folks, I know we'll talk about this later, but if folks are part of an institution that is not willing to acknowledge these harms, that there are individual actions that folks can take to support these movements.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Thanks for your response and also the examples that you provided. And then I'll also pass it over to Temi as well, if you could add comments to what is or what could be the role philanthropy plays in reparations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything plus one what everybody has said. For us, it's reckoning, right? Reckoning with the harm that we individually as institutions have created, that the sector has created, connecting with those communities that you harmed and letting them lead the solutions and the developments of what they believe reparations are to them, right? So we're talking about community-informed, community-led connections in a very transparent way. And then it's repair, and reparations is not grant making. It's not. And so it's actually making repair for those communities that were harmed from your wealth. And then it's decolonizing these institutions, right? So this goes to my point around if you give 5% of your endowment every year to keep these tax benefits, right, as a foundation, but yet you're invested in private prisons, you're invested in tobacco, you're invested in harmful industries. You need to decolonize all of that. And then it's also fund the reparations movement. Fund the advocacy of the movement. I believe that we should all be working ourselves out of a job. I don't think philanthropy can fix their lips to say liberation if they're not, or they're a liberation organization, unless you're talking about intentionally spending down. Free the resources. We should all, philanthropy should not exist. The nonprofit sector should not exist. People should have what they need. And the sooner we get to understanding that, the sooner we get to acknowledging the wealth is not ours and it needs to be given back to who it came from, then I think the closer we'll get to liberation, the closer we'll get to healing, the closer we'll get to self-determination.
Those are really good points. Thank you. And I think that actually allows a great transition to the next question. So what are some of the biggest threats and who are some of the biggest challenges to reparations work? And I'll first pass it to Dr. Arviso.
This is a hard question. You know, when I was going through my research, I think one of the things that I really thought about was that so many people don't actually know the history of this country. I think that unfortunately, you know, our education system has really whitewashed history. There are so many kind of hidden histories about Black and Indigenous communities that many people never learned. I know that for myself, I didn't have the opportunity to take like a Native American studies history class until I was in college. And it was only because I had an opportunity to go to a university that had a Native Studies department. And so, you know, even though I learned a lot from home, you know, my parents were both activists in different ways, I still feel like there's a whole, like all of this history that we're talking about is sometimes a huge surprise to people, even people that work in philanthropy who are often very well educated and carry a great deal of privilege. A lot of times when we're having these conversations, this is kind of new information to them. And I think that kind of the miseducation of people is probably one of the biggest threats, and then followed by white supremacy and racism, of sort of a denial that this is still something that that we haven't, you know, that Black and brown people have not gotten over yet, and that it's not an issue that still plagues our communities. So I'll start with that, but then, I also want to acknowledge what Dr. Banks said too. Just that, in the months that followed George Floyd's murder and this renewed fight for racial justice, we did see corporations and foundations respond, from statements of solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement and making these pledges for deeper commitments to tackle racial inequities and systemic racism within philanthropy. And I think a lot of us were really moved by that moment and sort of experienced a collective moment of hope. But since then, and particularly in this last year, I've really been privy to a number of conversations in the field where people are really beginning to question whether these commitments will be honored past those initial pledges, or if we'll only see a spike in one-time giving over a 5-year period before these trends sort of dip back into these dismal single digits again. I also feel this, I sense this collective fear that we might somehow squander this opportunity by not leveraging these funds towards greater change, or not by holding the sector accountable to seeing out a vision of what true racial equity could be. And, while all of those fears are based in elements of truth, I do want us to pay attention to the bigger picture, that we need to get outside of these dynamics of scarcity that make us feel like we're sort of all jockeying to get a sliver of the grant making budget, and into a place where we are really demanding collective abundance for all of us. And I think that's really where we can see, moments of allyship and solidarity across our two communities, to not be pitted against one another, but to really be saying there is enough money for all of us, especially if you begin to release the endowments.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think I'll also pass it to Dr. Bill, if you could talk about the threats and challenges to reparations work.
Yeah, so I think fear and scarcity are our biggest threats. Just to echo Dr. Arviso, we're seeing a retreat from those commitments, and at a time when we really need folks to double down on the acknowledgement. I feel like in the moments in 2020 during the racial reckoning that we experienced and were a part of, that there was real awareness of how harmful these systems have been. And often white supremacy is like a rubber band that snaps back. And so I think we just have to continue to keep the pressure to really snap the rubber band and make sure that we can center in the truth of why we are doing this work. And so, I think we're seeing also folks having their funding reduced because foundations are not honoring those commitments and moving those dollars in the same way. And so I think it's important to remember that reparations is not a punishment to anyone, but rather an opportunity for all of us to heal from those harms, and that there is no racial healing without reparations. And I think philanthropy in particular is in a unique position to be able to take what might be perceived as risks in this moment of backlash, to continue to hold strong and use flexible resources to give unrestricted funds to movements and organizations who are on the front lines of fighting for democracy, fighting for justice. And, all of that takes resources. And so liberating those dollars and affirming that commitment is critical right now. I would also say, there is, within any movement, we're human. And within any movement, there are going to be tensions over, what land back means, as you mentioned, Dr. Arviso, and what form reparations take. And this is a time for unity. It is a time for us to come together and work out our differences behind the scenes and continue to affirm that we have a right to that abundance and to attend to our collective liberation. The final thing I'll say is that one of the one of the threats that we're seeing is who controls the narrative. And Decolonizing Wealth Project worked with a researcher to do 2 years of audience testing research. I'll put the link in the chat around reparations narratives that resonate with non-Black folks. And so it's really about building solidarity and allyship to support reparations. And, you know, what we found in that report is that there are certain unifying messages that are critical for building support for reparations. And the key piece is that we are echoing those narratives throughout our movements, and that we are, you know, not allowing the forces of to control the airwaves, that we take the airwaves and we control the messages and not be diminished by the efforts to try and silence our truths. And so I just think the narrative change work is critical to the success of our movements.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Banks. And then I'll pass it over to Temi if you'd like to add any comments on the challenges and or threats to reparations work.
Yeah, I think the short answer is anti-Blackness. I think that when you look at what is the FBI report, like the big, like, and this is historically, the biggest group of survivors or victims of hate crimes in this country are Black people, yet we never see any Stop Black Hate campaigns that we see for other communities. All these commitments that happened in the alleged racial reckoning, and I say alleged because it never happened, they have not been made. They have not been made reality. Corporations are erasing DEI completely in their institutions, and it is out of fear because of what's happening in the rollbacks of affirmative action. I think that when you look at like the legal challenges, what's being used by the right in particular is using legislation that was created for our inclusion, now using that legislation against us. So what's happening is they're saying they're using the 14th Amendment, which was created for Black inclusion after enslavement, to say that you cannot use race as a class, and therefore reparation programs are illegal. And so Evanston was sued at the beginning of June, their reparations program. This is also going to contribute to the divisiveness, because this is also why Kamala, the chair of the California Reparations Task Force, why California went with lineage, because of their state constitution and to protect themselves against 14th Amendment challenges. And so there's an army of lawyers being funded by the right, to make sure that none of this actually ever happens, and even to make sure that we don't even we've been able to stand up task force and trying and start studies, but they're even challenging that. They don't even want us to study the harm, right? And so where is the army of lawyers that are fighting on the left, right? Where is the army of lawyers that are here to challenge? Where are the armies of lawyers that are there to say, Fearless Fund, we got this. You could keep doing what you're doing, and we will do this, instead of like the Fearless Fund losing all their grant makers because they're scared. Right? All these foundations erasing racial equity from their work and their portfolios. And it, again, it's rooted in anti-Blackness, and it's rooted in fear and this belief that if we are doing something to help Black people, then it is illegal, it is not right, and it is at the disadvantage of whiteness, right, or white people. And so a part of the work is also making white advantage visible, because when we do programs for ourselves, then we're seen to be anti-white, but like the default is whiteness, right? If all the funding, if we're carving out funds for Black people or Indigenous people's interest, and why the need to carve them out, it's because the default is whiteness and white advantage. And so a part of the work is also making whiteness visible, because they've been successful in making it invisible. They are the default. And so I think, again, I would say anti-Blackness, and a lot of it, I agree with Dr. Arviso around the ignorance around history, not knowing history. Some of the biggest, one of the biggest things that contributed to the definitions of race in America was dismantling Bacon's Rebellion, which was all around cross-racial labor solidarity. Granted, they wanted to continue to, like, Bacon wanted to be able to indiscriminately kill and take the lands of Indigenous. And in Virginia, the colony of Virginia, Bacon was able to get Black people, one Indigenous tribe, and poor white folks to come together to say, hey, let's fight the colonial powers here. And then when that happened, it took the British government to come and squash that. But then after that, that's when you start seeing the definition of whiteness and creating whiteness in this country and acknowledging that, like, it was somebody with no Indian or Negro blood is what they said, right? And so I think that we have to start getting real savvy around our solidarity, real savvy around our class and cross-racial solidarity. But then also, I think, it's a cautionary tale, because oftentimes what will happen, like, we will start these cross-racial collaborations, and then white supremacy comes in and, like, it posits us against each other, and folks are trying to get to whiteness. So then, okay, let's leave Black folks at the bottom. Let's continue to push Black folks at the bottom. So again, I would say a lot of it is rooted in anti-Blackness. I think that for me, one of the solutions is empowering and hiring and creating, like, a litigation force that's organized just as much as the right is. They've been organized. They've been, going after the judiciary since Roe v. Wade, and now now we're seeing those efforts, right? We're seeing the efforts of folks like Leo. If you haven't seen, We Don't Talk About Leonard, from the ProPublica articles that was done last October. I encourage folks to understand what we're up against when we're talking about these legal challenges that even the movement is facing now. Like, they're trying to snuff our work out before we even get started. And so you have to learn history. You have to be as organized as they are. We are not as organized as they are. And you have to develop an analysis on race. And a lot of folks don't know history, and they don't have an analysis on race. Mary McCabe talks about how you can go to prison and still not, you can be just because you went to prison does not mean you have an analysis of the prison system. And so you have to have an analysis of the systems that we're up against, not just as an individual with lived experience, but from a holistic, comprehensive, informed by history and the structures of white supremacy in this country. So I can pause there. And then the other thing I would say is, like, shift the resources. And in some instances, some folks want to be left alone after that. Shift the resources, fund them, and maybe leave them alone.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your responses. And then I believe this is the transition back to Trae. Yes.
Yes, it is. So I am back, and I got some Post-it notes. I'll tell you that. So I do want to be mindful of our panelist times. These amazing women are actively working and on the ground. And so I know that we are about to hit our time. And so if you do need to jet, I do completely understand. But I really want to also leave space and really bring out what Temi was talking about, and what I think all three of you have hit on is this is a scary time, and it is a time of opportunity. And I think that we have centered that idea of collective abundance and the idea of solidarity as central to racial equity work, as central to philanthropy's role in this. And I'm, as a Black and Indigenous man, I'm bringing in also that knowledge of, I think it was the Margaret Casey Foundation did a Project 2025 preparation panel just a few weeks ago as part of their summer school sessions. And we are bringing in, I think ABFI has recently released a historic underfunding analysis of HBCUs and the work that can play. And I'm acknowledging also the questions that we've had coming through about Indigenous boarding schools, and that we even have about, like, the backlash against jetty efforts. And so balancing that with being an Oklahoman and having, as it was previously mentioned, the Supreme Court dismiss that and the weight and heft that puts out on our communities and our organizers and those that are really on the front lines. So I'm hoping that we can use like our last question as a bit of hope, or as a bit of like a call to action, a galvanizing call of resources, of things in your closing statements that you want to leave our audience with, having a better understanding of. So if we can transition to that, I think that would be just really helpful. So Dr. Banks, I'll start with you of how do we walk away from this conversation and this time together?
Yeah, I think this point around history is critical. It's come up in multiple ways that we need to know where we've been to know where we're going. And so really understanding, both the history of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, and understanding where our efforts have intersected in the past and where there are opportunities for solidarity moving forward is critical. And in that process, examining the ways in which we have been, our thoughts, our actions, our behaviors, our beliefs have been impacted by white supremacy and colonization, so that we can root that out and not bring that into the solidarity conversations that we need to be having. So learning your history, examining biases and assumptions that we each may be bringing to this work, and then finding the people who are in your community, in your network, who want to join forces to do this work together. We can't do this work alone. It is not possible. And across this entire country, no matter what state you're in, there are people who are fighting for Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. And I think the point about getting organized and, not allowing fractures in the movement to hold us back. And so I think it's, finding your people and rooting out anti-Black beliefs, any, deficit thinking that you have about, or false beliefs of things that you've learned around Native people in this country, and really moving forward with clear heart and mind and knowledge of where we've been, so that, we can be stewards of this fight to advocate for the resources that are needed, that are owed to the community, the Black and Indigenous communities who have been fighting this fight for so long.
Absolutely. Temi, to you, how do we walk away? What resources? What do we need to keep in mind?
Yeah, and I want to go back in because I feel like I was trying to make the point, like, when there was cross-racial labor solidarity amongst Bacon Rebellion, and the colonies wanted to make sure that never happened again, that we started creating white affirmative action. And that's when we started creating privileges for white people, right? So indentured servants, when they finished their indentured servitude in Virginia, started getting 50 acres, a mill, a bushel of corn, and a musket, right? And so you start seeing white wealth built so that they would no longer see themselves in solidarity with their enslaved counterparts and Indigenous people's counterparts, right? So back to what should we do now? Which I believe the biggest thing I would say is learn history, develop an analysis on race. There are racial equity tools out there where you can start to develop your analysis. And when I mean develop an analysis on race, I'm really just asking, when you're debating a question, right, or you're trying to figure out a policy, will it be helpful? It's always winners and losers. And so you're going to look at that and you're going to figure out who's going to be burdened, who's going to be benefit from that decision, policy, or program. And oftentimes it will be Black, Indigenous, other folks of color who are going to be burdened, because that's how the system operates. It operates for white advantage. And that is how you develop an analysis, right? Like, we can't tell you every policy. Like, we need folks to get into this space and have their own independent thinking and have their own analysis. And my last thing, so I would say learn history, develop an analysis on race. And then I would say, like, we've been so focused on the legislative, and we should focus on the legislative, but we need to start looking at that judiciary branch. And so what is your litigation strategy? Would be my question for folks. What is your litigation strategy?
Absolutely. All right, Dr. Arviso, I'll end it with you. Our time together is, where do we go from here? What tools do we need? take your pick. I feel like so many things have been mentioned. This is a little challenging, but I'll throw it to you.
I feel like you stacked this panel with a lot of educators because education was like named as our number one thing. I wanted to agree with what both Dr. Banks and Temi said about developing a racial analysis and learning history. I wanted to share a couple of very specific links. So we talked a lot about the California Reparations Report, and so I do have a link for people to be able to access that directly. It's an incredibly powerful report, and I think will serve as a blueprint for other states as they move forward. One of the things that I did learn, though, was that I think that the reparations task force is really wanting the public to learn more about this and to have some more buy-in about why this work is so important. One panel that I was able to listen to last fall, which was part of Change Philanthropy's Unity Summit in Los Angeles in October, they did a really great kind of panel about reparations rising, pathways to just healing and equitable transformation. I actually don't think I have a link for that, but we can dig that up. But I felt like that was a really powerful panel as well to sort of unpack this topic more. And then one of the panelists was actually a member of the reparations task force and talked about like, what does it mean to be an ally in this work? And what does it mean for him to be a Japanese American man as the only non-Black person on that reparations committee? And what did that mean for him? I also saw that somebody asked a question about whether Indian boarding schools is a part of kind of a reparations package for Native people. There is currently legislation underway. And so I wanted to share the website for the Boarding School Healing Project. They did a piece on what is this Truth and Reconciliation Commission and understanding kind of like what the importance of establishing a U.S. Truth and Healing Commission is that talks specifically about Indian boarding schools. So I think they are in an they're trying to establish the commission itself, and then they would go through a process of really further documenting some of the harms that come in that, and then provide a set of recommendations. Reparations might be part of that. I'm not sure. But I also shared a link for the full text to the actual bill that is underway. So, I think there's a lot to learn out there. And I'm just appreciative for everybody that joined this session today, because this is where learning starts and this is where your curiosity peaks and you begin to like really understand that there's a lot of opportunities to dig into this topic and to be an ally and to be in solidarity with this work.
Absolutely. I think the starting that learning here, but then absolutely continuing that on. I would just elevate, I think, our panel, their organizations for the people that are doing that work, that are on those front lines, that are speaking intelligently about things like this. I mean, in even constructing this panel, I was really hesitant to share space because I'm vastly underqualified, and you all, I think, are just absolute powerhouses. And so thank you for your time, for sharing those resources. I do appreciate the education tie-in. I love resource sharing. So seeing all of those links being dropped, not only in the comments to our audience, but also like sharing them between one another is just reaffirming. So Chi Miigwech, or Iguien, even a heartfelt welcome, or a heartfelt thank you to Temi, Dr. Banks, and Dr. Arviso for their contributions and time together. So I do want to just transition to handing you back to Destiny Carrington for our NAP closing announcements, but just extending an enormous thank you for the time, talent, expertise, and the burden that all of our panelists are carrying in their work, in their professional lives, and personally. It is greatly appreciated and acknowledged by us here at NAP. So Black and Brown communities are still healing. For tribal nations, this healing must take place on many different fronts and from a nation-to-nation lens. This healing is evident of our resilience, and this resilience is shared and honored in other communities of color and our unified resistance against a colonizing oppressive force. The systematic oppression ingrained within and shaping our societies is generational. It is my hope that something from today has helped in strengthening your pursuit of being the best ancestor possible. So with that, I just want to say miigwech to you all for your time, your attention, and your participation. Again, the conversation does not stop here. If there is anything that we can do to connect you to these organizations, their work, their resources, please do not hesitate to let us know. We'll also provide their information at the end of this program. And likewise, I know that our partners at ADFI have a wealth of information, reports, and those analysis that were being mentioned provided on their website. So I would absolutely direct you there as well. I'm turning you back over to Destiny now for a few closing announcements. But just thank you all again for today's panel, for attending, for absolutely everything. It has left me, my mind is reeling. So I look forward to our conversation next month together, and I'll see you then. So Bamapi.
Thank you, Bobby, Trae, Gianni, Temi, Dana, Amber, and our audience members who tuned in and shared space with us today. We appreciate your continued support in our ongoing programming, and in particular, your support of our member education sessions. As a reminder, this session was open to the public as a highlight of our member benefits. NAP membership is open to Indigenous relatives and non-Indigenous allies. If you're not a NAP member yet and want to learn more, please visit our newly redesigned website, nativephilanthropy.org, or email Raina Day at rday@nativephilanthropy.org. Lastly, you should be receiving an email with a link to a short survey. Please take a few moments to share your opinions and what you like future sessions in this series to look like. It should take about 5 to 6 minutes to complete, but provides invaluable feedback for our team in planning. Our team has been hard at work getting some amazing programs put together for you over the next few months. Please make a point to join us and carve out space to prioritize conversations throughout the busy summer months. Next month, join us for a very special 2-part MES featuring an intimate conversation between NAP CEO Eric Stegman and the United States Treasurer Chief Lynn Malerba. Immediately followed by a panel discussion between representatives from the Native American Finance Officers Association and the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development. Thank you once again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon and a happy Juneteenth.